They thought he was just a scarred man with a limp and nothing to offer, a relic on crutches who hovered outside school gates like a ghost stepped between eras, and when one teacher whispered, "She talks about him like he's some kind of legend." But I see a broken body and a VA pension. The words slipped right through the hallway like they meant nothing, like the story behind those burn scars wasn't worth asking about. Staff Sergeant Chris Caldwell stood there anyway that morning, same as always, weathered face calm beneath a worn Marine Corps ball cap, prosthetic boot planted beside a rust-spent Dodge pickup, watching the classroom windows in quiet silence. That morning, something shifted, because the shadow box his daughter kept in her room, the one no one ever opened since his injury, finally cracked open at dawn. And inside it lay a folded letter with a general's seal and two medals that didn't even exist in the school's dusty civics textbook. And that day, something else cracked wide open too, something in his daughter's heart when the man supposed to teach her respect called her father's courage psychological baggage. So before we dive in, let me ask you this. If you still believe that wounds don't weaken a warrior, they prove he stood for something greater, then like and subscribe, because this story matters now more than ever. Maya Caldwell didn't notice the snickering at first. Her voice was steady, confident even, as she read her essay aloud at the front of the 7th grade civics classroom, clutching a printout titled, "My Personal Hero," her fingers trembling slightly where they gripped the pages. She had spent a week writing it, carefully picking the words her father would never use about himself, how he pulled 2 wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee and covered a third with his own body when a secondary blast lit the sky red. How he never spoke of what he lost in the years that followed, including most of his skin on the left side and the ability to run or kneel without pain. "My dad isn't famous," Maya said near the end, but he gave up pieces of himself so other families didn't lose all of theirs. The classroom was silent for half a breath, then came a few claps, awkward and soft. But the silence broke with a voice that cut like chalk screeching on a board. Mr. Whitman, arms folded, standing behind his desk, said dryly, "That's emotional, Maya. But let's remember, trauma doesn't equal heroism." A few kids snorted. Someone in the back muttered, "Yikes." Mr. Whitman smirked, flipping through his grading rubric. "Next time," he added, "maybe pick someone who chose to serve instead of someone who chose to get hurt." Maya didn't look up. She just returned to her seat, jaw clenched, blinking fast, the pages in her hand now crumpled at the corners. No one stood up for her. Not yet. But someone saw Dean Reyes, the soft-spoken janitor who swept that very hallway every evening, who wore an old army ring under latex gloves, and who just happened to walk past the door at the exact moment those words were spoken. He didn't say anything to Mr. Whitman. He didn't stop Maya on her way out. But that night, he made a quiet call to someone saved once in Fallujah by a sergeant with burn scars and a broken comms unit, and across the country, a web of old names began lighting up again, the names of soldiers who hadn't worn uniforms in years, but still carried the same code in their bones. You don't mock the man who covered the blast for you. Not ever. Meanwhile, Maya said nothing at dinner. Chris asked about school. She shrugged. When he leaned his cane against the table and pulled off his jacket, she stared a little too long at the outline of the old Marine patch sewn inside the sleeve, then looked away. Later that night, in her room, she opened the shadow box, the one that held his bronze star, a melted dog tag, and the letter she'd never dared ask him about, the one with the corner seal reading United States Central Command. And as she read it in silence, something shifted. Because Maya had spent her whole life believing her father was brave, but now, she realized something harder. Some people only remember heroism when it comes wrapped in parades and salutes. But her dad, he remembered it in pain, in silence, in showing up every day, even when they laughed. And that was the moment, before dawn, when across 4 states and 3 time zones, boots began hitting floors, ribbons were brushed clean, and old call signs were activated by men who owed a debt that could never be repaid. Because they heard what happened to Maya. And to them, that meant only one thing. It was time to report in, not to the base, not to a command, but to a classroom. Mr. Whitman's classroom returned to its routine the next day like nothing had happened, except now Maya Caldwell kept her eyes down, her voice quieter than usual, her notebook closed even when the assignment was open. And when a student bumped her shoulder in the hallway and sneered, "Careful, you might get a PTSD flashback like your dad," the laughter wasn't loud, but it was enough to echo. Meanwhile, Chris Caldwell stood in the pickup line like he always did, leaning against his truck with that same uneven stance, one boot scuffed, the prosthetic one gleaming under the sun, face unreadable beneath the brim of a hat worn smoother than sanded stone. He didn't ask Maya why she hadn't looked at him when she climbed in. He saw it in her posture, how she held her backpack tight across her chest, how she didn't tell him what her presentation grade was, and how she said "fine" 3 times on the drive home without meaning it once. That night, after she went to bed, Chris walked into the garage, flicked on the dusty overhead light, and opened the old green ammo box he hadn't touched in 5 years. Inside were no weapons, just a sat phone, wrapped in a towel beside a list of numbers written on waterproof parchment, and above those numbers, 2 words, "in case needed." He dialed the first one slowly, waited through the static, then spoke only 3 words. They shamed her. The response came instantly, not shock, not pity, but one sentence: "I'll be there by Thursday." And just like that, the signal spread. Across Texas, California, the Carolinas, and up through Virginia, boots were pulled from closets, pins polished, flight alerts checked, and old marine patches stitched back onto denim and leather, not because someone called for revenge, but because one of their own had been laughed at for the very wounds that had saved their lives. Back in town, the whispers at school only grew. Someone printed a meme with Maya's dad photoshopped onto a movie poster for burn notice. It spread through phones like wildfire, until it landed in the inbox of Dean Reyes, the janitor, who didn't reply but quietly forwarded it to a private server he hadn't used since 2009. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitman doubled down. "You're emotionally manipulating your classmates," he told Maya in front of her group during civics prep. "Heroism is about impact, not injury." She didn't speak, didn't even lift her head, but that night, she slipped her dad's folded letter from under her pillow and began recopying it by hand, word for word, onto her notebook page like scripture. That same evening, Colonel Jacob Marks landed at a small regional airport 2 towns over, carrying a duffel bag and a folder filled with combat logs signed by the very officer Maya's teacher claimed was just another broken vet. He didn't wear his uniform, not yet, but the look in his eyes at the rental car counter said everything. He was here on business. And across the hotel hall, another man checked in, Sergeant Tom Ruiz, burn scars across both forearms, still carrying the same pocket knife Chris Caldwell had handed him seconds before the convoy exploded. Neither of them needed to call the others, they were already en route. Back in class, Maya turned in a revised version of her project, this time with the general's letter attached as an appendix, and Mr. Whitman glanced at it and muttered, "I suppose fantasy writing is still technically writing," before setting it aside. What he didn't know, what the whole school didn't know, was that 21 men and women, all from the 3rd Recon Delta, had begun arriving quietly at a motel just blocks from the school. They didn't sign in with rank or titles. They didn't wear ribbons or decorations. But in their eyes lived a storm, the kind that only comes from people who've been forged in fire, not the kind that breaks you, but the kind that makes you walk slower, speak less, and burn hotter when your own are insulted. On Wednesday, the principal received an anonymous letter printed on military-grade parchment. It read, "This Friday, the lesson is ours. No threats, no names. Just a list of former unit call signs in the title Caldwell Shield." The secretary thought it was a prank. The vice principal chuckled nervously. But the school's resource officer, a former Army MP, read it, went pale, and said, "We need to be ready." Because anyone who knew those call signs knew what they meant. But Platoon wasn't coming for confrontation, they were coming for correction. That night, Maya sat by her window, staring into the yard where her dad practiced walking without his cane, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he had a feeling he might be walking through a door soon that required something deeper than balance. And when he finished, sweat dripping down one side of his face, he looked up at her window, nodded once, and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "They're coming." And they remember. Across town at the motel, the veterans reviewed the classroom layout, not like a tactical op, but like a mission to be handled with precision, not vengeance. They agreed on one thing: they wouldn't wear uniforms. They didn't need to. Because their scars were their badges, their silence their formation, and Maya, she was the rally point. They had once followed Caldwell into a firestorm. On Friday, they'd follow him into a school. It began just before the second period bell on Friday morning, when the rain outside thinned to a mist and the clouds shifted like curtains parting on a stage, and as Mr. Whitman reviewed the day's civics assignment, a smug list of modern hero comparisons. Something changed in the air, something taut and hushed that made even the most restless students fall quiet without knowing why. The first sign was the creak of the classroom door opening slowly, not like an interruption, but like an arrival. One by one, they entered, 23 of them in total, men and women of varying age, posture, and gait, but with one thing in common: the weight of presence. No uniforms. No salutes. Just scars and stillness and a clarity in their eyes that made time itself hesitate. They took the back row, then filled the sides, standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. A man with a steel leg and a burn-scarred scalp. A woman with a limp and a patch over her left eye. A hulking figure with 3 fingers missing, cradling a battered satchel like it held commandments. Mr. Whitman straightened behind his desk, clearing his throat like he had authority, muttering, "I'm sorry, this is a closed," but his voice faded as Staff Sergeant Chris Caldwell stepped through the door, not quickly, not dramatically, just steady. His limp more pronounced, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his gaze unwavering as he moved to the side of the room without a word, every eye in the class now fixed on Maya, who sat frozen at her desk, mouth parted, fingers clenched around the edges of her notebook like it was all that anchored her. She didn't move. Neither did the platoon. "What's going on?" Mr. Whitman asked, trying again, louder now, trying to reclaim the room. And that's when Colonel Jacob Marks stepped forward, gently placing a folder on Whitman's desk. "This," he said quietly, "is the man you mocked. And these are the people who followed him." Whitman opened it, glanced at the citations, the photos, the letter signed by a 4-star general with a handwritten note beneath, "The most composed leader I've served under, and the reason I made it home." The teacher stammered, but Colonel Marks had already turned to face the class. "We're not here for punishment," he said. "We're here for clarity." Then, one by one, the platoon began to speak. A man with a cracked voice said, "He pulled me out of a fire." A woman whispered, "He gave up his airlift seat so I could get home to my daughter." Another, "He covered my body with his own during the ambush. My spine is still intact because of them." A final voice, "He told me I mattered, after my own family didn't." The room was silent, unmoving, the students no longer amused, no longer scrolling through phones or passing notes, but frozen, some with tears caught at the edges of their lashes, some shifting in discomfort. All of them seeing Maya's father not as a silhouette by the pickup line, but as the living cornerstone of 24 lives that wouldn't exist without him. And then Sergeant Ruiz stepped forward, holding something small and wrapped in velvet. He handed it to Maya with trembling hands. Inside was a rusted dog tag fused with heat, the lettering barely visible. "He found this," he said, "and used it to trace a man's pulse while under enemy fire. That man was me." Maya took it slowly, her hands shaking, but her back straightening. She looked at her father, then at the platoon, and for the first time since Monday, she smiled. Just a little. Not out of pride. Out of recognition. Whitman sat back, speechless now, unsure how to regain control of a classroom that no longer needed him. Principal Harris, having been informed by the front desk that something important was happening, stepped inside quietly, took one look at the room, and simply stood at attention in the corner, saying nothing. And finally, Chris Caldwell stepped forward. He said only one sentence. "I didn't come here for me." He looked at Maya. "I came because she thought being quiet meant being wrong." He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, turned, and started to walk out. The platoon followed, no words exchanged, no fanfare requested. Just presence, like smoke from a fire that had long ago burned, but never died. As they reached the doorway, a voice rang out, hesitant but firm, "Sir." It was one of Maya's classmates. Then another, "Sir." And another, "Thank you, sir." And one by one, the room rose to its feet. The kids. The teachers. Even Mr. Whitman, silent now, ashamed. Maya stood last. The class didn't applaud. They saluted with silence. And outside, when the rain stopped and the sky began to clear, a small crowd of students followed them to the lot, watching as the veterans shook hands and embraced and dispersed like wind in every direction. But on Maya's desk, one item remained, a handwritten note, pinned by Colonel Marks. "Legacy isn't loud. It stands." Even when mocked. That night, the school's homepage quietly added a new section under guest speakers. No headlines. No photos. Just one phrase, "The platoon that came for the girl." And in her room, Maya added something new to her shadow box beside the general's letter, the fused dog tag, still warm with memory. From that day forward, the mocking stopped. But more importantly, the silence stopped too, because when a platoon walks into a classroom, they don't come to teach history. They come to finish it.